On the morning of the 9th of November, 1932, a housekeeper walked into the bedroom of Nadezhda Alliluyeva, the wife of Joseph Stalin, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, and found her dead on the floor with a small pistol beside her hand and a letter on the table that her husband would read once, throw on the floor, and never mention again for the rest of his life. She was 30 years old. She had been married to Stalin for 13 years. She had given him 2 children. She had believed in the revolution with the kind of pure ideological faith that Stalin himself had long since replaced with something colder and more useful. And on the night of the 8th of November, she had sat across a dinner table from her husband at an official Kremlin banquet, watched him flick bread pellets at her and call her, "Hey you," in front of the entire Soviet leadership, walked out of that banquet into the cold Moscow night, and made a decision that Stalin would spend the next 21 years pretending had never happened. What makes this story genuinely extraordinary is not just that Stalin's wife killed herself, although that alone would be remarkable enough given everything that surrounded it, but that the entire Soviet Union was told she had died of appendicitis, that her death was reported in Pravda with the kind of careful medical language designed to make 30 million people believe something that everyone in the Kremlin already knew was a lie, and that Stalin apparently found it easier to rewrite the official cause of death of his own wife than to spend 30 seconds acknowledging that she had made a choice about him, specifically, and about what he represented that he could not control and could not forgive. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Nadezhda Alliluyeva actually was, because the version of her that Soviet history preserved, the loyal wife quietly mourned, bears almost no resemblance to the real person who walked out of that banquet. She was born in 1901 into a revolutionary family. Her father, Sergei Alliluyev, was an old Bolshevik who had known Lenin personally and had sheltered him in his apartment in 1917, in the days before the October Revolution, which meant that Nadezhda had grown up inside the revolution the way other children grow up inside particular religions, absorbing its language and its certainties and its moral framework before she was old enough to question any of them. She met Stalin when she was a child, and he was already a significant figure in the revolutionary underground, and she married him in 1919 when she was 17 years old, and he was nearly 40, which even by the standards of the time was the kind of age gap that tells you something about the respective positions of the two people involved. For the first years of the marriage, she was genuinely devoted to him, working as his personal secretary, managing his correspondence, running his household with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that supporting the revolution meant supporting the man at the center of it. And Stalin in those early years was capable of something that looked enough like warmth that the people around him occasionally mistook it for the real thing. But as the 1920s became the 1930s, and as Stalin's power consolidated into something that no longer needed to pretend to be collegial, Nadezhda began to see things that could not be unseen. And unlike virtually everyone else in Stalin's immediate circle, she had not yet learned the crucial survival skill of pretending that what she was seeing was something else entirely. By 1932, she was a student at the Industrial Academy in Moscow, attending classes alongside the children of ordinary Soviet citizens, and what she was hearing from those students about the reality of collectivization and the famine that was spreading through Ukraine, and the Kuban was so different from the official picture that Stalin presented at Politburo meetings that she had started bringing these reports home and telling him what she was hearing, which was exactly the kind of behavior that Stalin found intolerable in subordinates, and apparently found even more intolerable in a wife. She was not supposed to be a source of uncomfortable information. She was not supposed to have opinions about agricultural policy. She was not supposed to come home from university and tell the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that people were dying in the countryside in numbers that the newspapers were not reporting, and that her classmates were frightened, and that something was terribly wrong. Stalin's response to these conversations was the same response he gave to any intelligence that contradicted his preferred version of reality, which was to dismiss the source, and in this case, the source was sleeping in the same bedroom. The banquet on the 8th of November, 1932, was a celebration of the 15th anniversary of the October Revolution, held in the Kremlin with the full senior leadership of the Soviet state in attendance, and by all accounts, it had the atmosphere of an event where everyone was performing their enjoyment for an audience of one. Stalin was drinking, which he did at these occasions with the particular deliberateness of a man who used alcohol as a social instrument rather than an escape, and at some point during the evening, he turned his attention to Nadezhda in the way that people who have watched a powerful man decide to humiliate someone in public can always recognize with that specific quality of casual cruelty that is somehow worse than open anger, because it signals that the person being humiliated is not even worth genuine emotion. He flicked bread pellets across the table at her and addressed her as "Hey you," not by her name, not by any term of endearment, but as "Hey you" in front of Molotov and Voroshilov and Budyani and every other senior figure of the Soviet state, making it absolutely clear in the most public possible way that whatever she was to him, it was not someone whose name he felt obliged to use. Nadezhda stood up and walked out of the banquet, which itself required a kind of courage that is easy to underestimate, because walking out on Stalin in front of his entire court was not a neutral act. It was a statement, and everyone at that table understood it as one. Ekaterina Voroshilova, the wife of Marshal Voroshilov, followed her out and found her in the Kremlin gardens, and the two women walked together for a while in the cold November night. Nadezhda upset, but not, by Ekaterina's later account, appearing to be in the kind of state that would have suggested what she was about to do. Ekaterina walked her back to her apartment, said goodnight, and went home, and sometime in the hours that followed, Nadezhda Alliluyeva took the small Walther pistol that her brother Pavel had brought her from Germany, went to her bedroom, and shot herself. The pistol itself is a detail that historians have returned to repeatedly because it raises a question that has never been fully answered, which is why Nadezhda had asked her brother to bring her a gun from Germany in the first place, since a woman living in the Kremlin as the wife of the head of state had no obvious practical need for a personal firearm, which suggests either that she had been thinking about this for longer than one difficult evening, or that she had wanted it for reasons of personal safety that said something deeply unsettling about what it felt like to live in that apartment. Pavel Alliluyev, for his part, did not understand why his sister had wanted the pistol and spent the rest of his life with that particular knowledge, until Stalin had him arrested in 1938 and shot, because apparently even being the brother of Stalin's dead wife was not sufficient protection against the Great Terror if Stalin had decided you were inconvenient. When Stalin was told what had happened, his first reaction, according to the people who were present, was not grief in any recognizable form, but something closer to a furious incomprehension. The response of a man who had been defied in a way he had not anticipated and could not categorize. He said she has gone away as an enemy, which tells you everything you need to know about how he processed personal loss, which is to say that he processed it as a political event, a betrayal, an act committed against him, rather than a decision made by a person in unbearable pain. He went to see her body and reportedly turned her face away from him, and at the funeral he walked up to the open coffin and then turned away without touching her, a gesture that the people watching interpreted variously as grief, guilt, and rage, and which was probably all three simultaneously expressed in the way that only Stalin could express things, which was by refusing to express anything at all. The letter she left him has never been published in full, and its complete contents remain unknown, but the fragments that have been described by people who claim to have seen it suggest that it was both personal and political, that she wrote about his treatment of her, and also about the country and what was happening in it, which means that even in her final hours, Nadezhda Alliluyeva was still trying to make Stalin understand something that he had already decided he did not want to understand. He read it and threw it on the floor and never discussed its contents with anyone, and the letter itself disappeared into whatever archive Stalin used for things he wanted to exist but never be seen. What happened to the people around Nadezhda in the years that followed tells you more about how Stalin experienced her death than anything he ever said directly, because Stalin expressed his inner states through personnel decisions rather than words, and the personnel decisions he made about everyone connected to her memory form a pattern that is unmistakable. Her brother Pavel was shot in 1938. Her friends from the Industrial Academy found themselves in increasingly difficult positions. The housekeeper who found her body spent years in a state of quiet terror. And Nadezhda's own children were left to grow up in an apartment where their mother's name was not spoken, where her photographs had been removed, where the fact of her existence had been edited out of daily life with the same thoroughness that the NKVD applied to editing inconvenient people out of official photographs. Svetlana, who was 6 years old when her mother died, learned the truth not from her father, but from a nanny who told her years later, and she spent her entire childhood in the presence of a man who had decided that the most efficient response to his wife's suicide was to behave as though she had never existed. Svetlana eventually wrote about all of this in her memoir, 20 Letters to a Friend, which she published after defecting to the West in 1967. And what she described was not a father in mourning, but a father who had replaced mourning with erasure, who had taken the space where Nadezhda had been and filled it with silence so complete and so deliberate that it functioned as its own kind of statement, the statement of a man who could not forgive someone for making a choice he had not authorized. Stalin visited her grave on Novodevichy Cemetery exactly 0 times in the 21 years between her death and his own, which is the kind of fact that you can interpret as grief too large to face, or as the final verdict of a man who had classified his wife as an enemy and saw no reason to reconsider the classification just because she was dead. The version of events that the Soviet people received was a brief notice in Pravda announcing that Nadezhda Sergeyevna Alliluyeva, member of the Communist Party since 1917, had died after a sudden and serious illness, and that the Central Committee extended its condolences to Comrade Stalin, and that was the entire public record of what had happened in that bedroom on the 9th of November, 1932. 30 years old on the floor with a pistol and a letter that her husband threw down and never picked up again, condensed into 3 sentences about appendicitis and revolutionary service, and the sympathies of the party. The Soviet Union did not learn the truth for 60 years. Stalin never told them. He never told anyone. He behaved for the remaining 21 years of his life as though the whole thing had simply not occurred, which was in its own way the most revealing thing he ever did, because a man who could erase his own wife's suicide from his personal history with that kind of completeness was a man for whom reality had long since become entirely optional.